Today's story comes from the town of Oldham, just outside of Manchester, and a little place called Hollingwood, and a house called Birchen Bower. It used to be home, in the 18th century, to a Hannah Beswick, a spinster, and most famous for being Manchester's very real mummy.
A dismal autumn evening. The mist hangs heavy on the silent landscape and wreaths in ghostly folds above the stream. Along the highway rides carefully a man of sober garb, who, passing the ancient Bower house, continues his way to the smaller residence by the riverside at Birchen Clough in Lancashire. So, she has left it, he mutters as he glances back at the ancient residence, now but faintly outlined in the mist. A goodly property, and she fears the grave. Ha! Who will inherit it, I wonder, and her money? If rumour speaks truly, she has buried it. The old gabled mansion, even then falling to decay, was slowly swallowed up with a swirling mist, now agitated by an imperceptible breeze which hardly stirred the dying leaves on the trees or deflected from their course those that fell fluttering to the ground. The doctor, for such was the traveller, rode on to the small house by the stream, past the antiquated barn and the glistening horse pond, where the cattle farm of the old Bower house were daily watered. So on, amid the mist, with clattering hooves, up the stony road to his destination, rode the doctor. He halted at the isolated house and knocked after throwing his horse's bridle over a staple by the door. An elderly woman came and cautiously opened the door slowly and silently. "'Tis I, woman, fear not," said the visitor, somewhat impatiently. "Open to me quickly." "The doctor? Mr. White?" "You can enter, sir. No one more welcome to my mistress, I dare say." Her manner did not indicate any great cordiality, however, as she permitted the doctor to enter the lonely house. Closing the door carefully, she preceded him upstairs, and having abruptly ushered him into her mistress's apartment, she withdrew to place the doctor's steed in an adjacent shed at the rear of the building. "Wonder what he's up to," muttered she. "Mistress Beswick will keep tight hold of her money bags. Even Dr. White will hardly find them. It's cruel and bitter cold out here tonight." Throwing a couple of sacks over the horse's back, the woman tramped back into the house, again muttering as she went. "What Satan's business are they working on?" she thought. "I am deaf, ha ha ha, ha ha, but none is so deaf as can't hear something. I'll up and listen." She was by no means deaf, this Bridget, but it suited her purpose to appear so. She possessed a good share of curiosity, and therefore made no excuse to herself for going upstairs and listening to the conference proceeding in the room above. The doctor and his patient were deep in confabulation. The old lady, Miss Beswick, had in the former days, in the stirring times of the 45, resided in the house, the old Bower house aforementioned. But nervous fears of the young pretender, Bonnie Prince Charlie, and his adherents, the dread of plunder, the lonely situation, the natural nervous feelings inseparable from her superstitious temperament, induced the lady to quit her home and reside in the smaller one, where we found her today. She was not liable in the smaller house to be robbed. The assailants might work their wicked will upon the old house, but they would not find her treasured hoards or hoarded treasure. Not they. It was all too securely hidden. But age increased, and as time approached, when the aging spinster knew that in all probability she must leave this sphere and pass into the unknown, she became more and more imbued with the fear of dissolution. Earth to earth, dust to dust, was the sentence she had a horror of. Was her body, still well shapen and not uncomely for her years, to be resolved into dust in the grave? She could not bear the idea of being buried and of crumbling then to decay. By degrees, her mind became so imbued with the spirit of resistance to the final sentence on humanity that she made up her mind to avoid it. Her body should never be buried. Her spirit should not forsake the place where all her wealth, all her hopes in life were centered. Her body must remain in possession, even if the estate must pass to strangers or relatives. With these views at the forefront of her mind, the old lady interviewed the physician, who was not blind to his own interests, and humoured her. Old Bridget kept upstairs and, stooping, listened at the door. Her mistress was speaking. "I must not be put underground, you hear?" "I hear, madam," was the reply. "But there is no danger yet." "No, perhaps not. But I feel more easy in my mind now that I have your promise." "And I yours," replied the doctor with a bow. "Decidedly," she replied. "On the condition named, you shall be the possessor. None of my relatives will do my behests. My body shall remain in peace. I could not die happy if I fancied that my frame and flesh would be confided to a grave, to decay and corruption." "Rest assured, madam, you will not be condemned to such indignity," replied the doctor. "I myself will take the needful steps if you so express your wishes in your testament." "I will do so, sir, and I rely upon your honour to carry out my wishes." "Madam," said the physician, "your confidence is not misplaced. You may depend upon me. And the money?" Yes. You must rest satisfied. It is safe. Over there," she replied with a cunning smile. "No one will discover it. My spirit will guard it day and night. Of that I am assured. The spirit and the treasure will be found together." "Where the treasure is," muttered the doctor. "Well, madam, I must away. I will have your wishes faithfully observed." "And I shall never be put underground?" "Not while I live," he replied. "If you break your word, you will lose all," menacing him with a forefinger. "Beware." Bridget heard no more. She quitted her post of observation as the doctor approached the chamber door. In a few moments he appeared in the entrance of the hall. "My horse," he said quickly. "It's in the shed," she replied. "I will light you. This way." He followed her, and after a while mounted the animal. As he rode away, Bridget watched him, and then, muttering something about this shelter Joe, she turned back into the kitchen, pondering up what she had heard. After a few days, a lawyer arrived from Manchester, and certain business was transacted by Miss Beswick. Then Bridget knew the will was signed, as she had witnessed it. When the lawyer had departed, Bridget remained in the room. She did not trouble to see him off the premises as she had the doctor. Miss Beswick wondered what she wanted. "So you've made your will," said Bridget. "I have. You saw that," replied the mistress sharply. "And your poor relations will get none of it?" "How do you know? My money is my own to leave as I please." I know. You buried your money, if you won't be buried yourself. But you'll never rest until the house is down and your money is released. Then you'll be buried, and your spirit may be quiet." "You dare speak to me like this, you hag! Out with you! Be gone! Leave me! My money is safe in the Bower. My body will never be buried. Go! Go! Never let me see your face again." "Indeed, and you won't then," replied the woman. "I'll go to my nephew Joe's. Pleasant dreams to you, you old miser. You and your doctor's a nice pair. Go! Yes, I'm going. But you'll never rest in your grave until your own people get their own." Bridget departed that same day. Old Miss Beswick slept and woke and cried aloud for help, but none arrived. The woman had taken her at her word and left her. Bridget went to her nephew's home. He was a hand-loom weaver, and times were hard, and they were about to get even worse in the looming future. The aunt confided her suspicions to the young man, and he counselled her to return. But Bridget was obstinate. She would go the next day. Let the woman alone to ponder the money bags and schemes. "The money's in the house below," she said to Joe. "If you can find it, you'll be rich all your days. Aye, but how's one to find it? I can't take the old house. The next morning, Bridget, somewhat stricken in her conscience and alarmed by a dream, set off for the small house by the mill stream. She entered. All was silent, strangely silent. Her footsteps seemed to echo in the passage. A rush of air met her. A casement was open. Someone had entered in her absence. Who? Bridget's pulses beat faster as she perceived that some disturbance had taken place. Someone had entered and robbed the house, and Miss Beswick. Was she alarmed, or had the man or woman not disturbed her? Silence everywhere. Not even the scamper of a rat was to be heard in the stillness of the old house. Bridget crept slowly upstairs to her mistress's chamber door. She paused, listened, entered. The room was in disorder. She advanced boldly, pulled aside the curtains, and looked into the bed. Miss Beswick lay dead. There were no signs of violence. The old lady had died from fright. Bridget closed the curtains and the shutters and went downstairs to think it over. What was she to do? Was she to blame? Someone had entered and tried to rob the old woman was evident. Could she, Bridget, have prevented this? No. She came to the conclusion that she could not have done so. She could have done nothing more but hurry to Manchester for a doctor. He was surprised at the woman's confession and blamed her severely for leaving the house. "You needn't care," replied Bridget roughly. "You'll get her property, I suppose. A fine bargain you made. Please, woman, it will be well if we do not find that you have had a hand in this business." Bridget was silenced. She perceived that the doctor could make things very unpleasant for her if he chose. She therefore assumed a more quiet demeanour and returned to the desolate house with the doctor. He at once perceived that the old lady had died from natural causes, but did not confide this to Bridget. In the course of time, the will was read, and in accordance with his promised instructions, the body was embalmed, the head being severed from the trunk during the operation in the doctor's museum. The body was removed to the doctor's house in the city, as he prospered. The will, devised him to her property. Birchen Bower house was permitted to fall into decay, but people who passed that way confessed to seeing strange sights. The doctor heard all these stories, but did not credit them. Nevertheless, no one would live in the Bower house, and witnesses came to declare that the old lady in black, a tall woman, had appeared, sometimes headless, on clear nights, by the old well, by the barn, and the horse pond on the farm. "That's where lies her money," they said, and steps were taken to search all these places, but with no results at that time. Meantime, the house remained unlet. The years passed, and the 7th anniversary of Miss Beswick's death arrived. People were surprised to see a conveyance bearing what seemed to be a body of a woman or a man come to the old granary. There the corpse was deposited. In the farm it was left, for the doctor was faithfully carrying out his agreement. Once in every 7 years my body must rest in the old house. So it was. But the actors in that procession did not contemplate the consequences. The cattle were found straying, horses were at large in the field, and a cow was in the loft to which it could not have climbed by any natural means. The ghost had done all this, they declared. There was considerable uneasiness manifested in the farm. The old lady was evidently walking. Labourers returning home saw the barn a mass of lurid flame, and hurrying to quench the fire found no sign of it. The dark, tall, spectral shape continued to pervade the place, and Birchen Bower house was haunted by the old lady seeking her treasure. The doctor, White was his name, then possessed of the broad acres, determined to make use of her ancestral abode, which he could not let. Perhaps some tenants would not object to a house containing treasure. So the old Bower house was cut up and divided into separate sets of rooms or wings. To one of those wings came Joe O'Tanner, the nephew of Bridget the maid. Bridget had sufficient superstition to invite her nephew to take it, even if haunted. "Who cares?" he declared. "I never injured she. She won't hurt I." So the wing was occupied. Joe and family were comfortably settled, and nothing alarmed them for a while. But ere long as Joe was sitting in his room, a tall dark shape entered and moved slowly in the direction of the parlour. Frozen with fear, he gazed at it. Was it real, or only a game? He passed out. He followed it to the parlour. It glided, and stooping over a certain spot, disappeared. This was rather alarming, but Joe's wife derided it. She wasn't going to be frightened at shapes, even if they existed, which she didn't believe. But when the figure appeared on the next night, and after on several occasions, the residents were compelled to admit the truth of the manifestation. It did no harm. It made itself heard in the old house, and its approach was audible. "Hush," they would say. "Here comes the old lady." Sure enough, she arrived, passed on into the parlour, and vanished. This continued for a while until Joe and his wife, being hardy and accustomed to it, thought of watching the spot and delving there for amusement and possible treasure. "If there's aught in it, that is," said Joe with solemnity. "Next time we'll turn it up." Accordingly, when the next time the spectre came, the valiant couple tracked it closely. It glided into the parlour, stood a moment. Joe said it had no head, and then suddenly vanished, as if it had gone down a trapdoor. "That's the spot, Dolly. There, we tries it. Up with the boards." With some difficulty the boards were taken up that evening, and after considerable searching a small tin vessel was found. "Pull it up and prise it open," cried Dolly. Joe willingly complied. Work was slack just then, and the weavers were having a sore time of it. In fact, it was called the barley times. The vessel, when opened, staggered the seekers. It was full of small wedges which looked like solid gold. "My Joe, this is luck," exclaimed the faithful wife. "We needn't climb any more." We needn't," was the dubious response. "If it's real, that is. There's sight stuff here, mind. Mind, keep your tongue in your head, and we'll find out. Tomorrow I'll go to Manchester and make inquiries. Who would believe it? Who'd have thought the old lady would have come through for us, eh? Bridget always said there was something in it. And it's true as gospel. Look, ain't them heavy?" The couple passed several hours discussing the finding of the treasure, and the dawn found them still busy with speculations. As soon as it was possible, Joe started off for Manchester with one of his golden wedges, and ascertained beyond doubt that it was a precious metal of unquestionable value. The jeweller to whom he submitted it was naturally desirous to ascertain the source of whence his good fortune proceeded, and Joe, fearing that he would get into trouble if he did not confess, made a clean breast of it to Mr. Oliphant. Of course, the jeweller was incredulous, and it was not until all the particulars were disclosed and eyewitnesses had testified to the truth that the critic was satisfied. Of course, the news spread after a while, and much curiosity was evoked, but Joe kept his money, and the tin vessel in which he found it was said to be still preserved by his descendants. But this success did not lay the restless spirit, the headless lady. She appeared again and again. Sometimes the old barn is brilliantly illuminated, and searchers for the fire are surprised to find the old place grey and dull when they arrive there. She plays queer tricks still. It is said, though, after all this lapse of years, most of the old house has fallen to decay. The property remained in the hands of the doctor's family. This gentleman rose to some eminence, and after a while presented the embalmed body to his Natural History Museum on Peters Street in Manchester. The visitations of the old lady were continued as long as the doctor remained.
alive, but after many years the body was no longer transported to Bower House, and the incidents related fell into limbo of lost narratives. The house became dilapidated, but people still declared that a black, tall lady haunted the precincts of the well and the cattle pond. So matters wore on until the year of 1868. The authorities of the museum, wishing to have more space for their collection, set their house in order. The long-forgotten embalmed remains were not now required. The donor had passed away. The body was examined and found of no particular interest, we may suppose, for the orders were issued for its burial. This ceremony was accordingly performed on the 22nd of July, 1868, and aroused some curiosity. What was this body, which was thus quietly interred in an unmarked grave? Whose was it? The deceased doctor had placed it in his museum, no doubt, but for what reason? Inquiry was made, and of course the incident reached the local papers. The old stories were revived, and no doubt certain incidents and items of information were added, but substantially the narrative in its chief points remained as we have related it. The account of the funeral was thus narrated in local print in the year of 1868 under the date of August the 15th. On July the 22nd were committed to the earth in the Halfrey Cemetery the remains of Miss Beswick, removed from the Peter Street Museum. There is a tradition that this lady had acquired a strong fear of being buried alive, so strong that she left certain property to her medical attendant, so long as she could be kept above ground. For many years past, the mummy has been lodged in the rooms of the Manchester Natural History Society. It seems the commissioners have deemed the specimen undesirable and have at last buried it. Some people imagine that the old lady would cease to haunt the place when it was altered, and after her treasure had been discovered, but they were mistaken. Accounts from the 1880s state that she was seen near the old well by the brookside when a presumed heir to her estate was pressing his claim. Another story is that a rustic going to fetch a pail of water beheld a tall lady standing by the well. She was wearing a black gown and had a white cap with frilled border of those stiff, old-fashioned puffs which were formerly worn. She stood in the dusk in a defiant attitude. These appearances are regarded as a sign that the family has not yet obtained its own again. As regards Joe, the man who found the treasure, we now learn that it was by accident, not design, that he found the gold. He intended to erect a loom for his children, says our authority, so that they might learn to weave, and in digging the treadle hole he found a tin vessel filled with gold wedges valued at £3 10 shillings each. At least that's what was said in the 1870s by people who were still living and knew Joe, and the man, Mr. Oliphant, who turned the gold lumps into coins, lived in St. Anne's Square in Manchester. It would be interesting to learn whether anyone has seen an elderly lady lately whose headless spirit has for so many years haunted the old house at Hollingwood. Whether the interment that took place in 1868 has restored the property to the relatives of the deceased lady, only local lawyers can tell. At any rate, the body was embalmed, the gold was found, and there have not been lacking many witnesses to the apparitions of Birchen Bower House. This story of the haunting has been gathered from various sources, and many of the particulars appeared in the Oldham newspapers in the 1800s. Now, why on earth would someone want to be mummified? Well, one story was told to the effect that a favourite old willow tree was cut down by her brother without having first obtained her consent, and to punish him for the act, she so arranged her affairs to prevent her fortune from passing into his hands. Another account which would seem to embody the most popular belief, referred to the horror which Madame had of the possibility of being buried alive. It was stated that a brother of Madame Beswick's had a narrow escape from a dreadful fate. Madame Beswick's brother, who drove pack horses between Manchester and Hebden Bridge in Yorkshire, was suddenly taken ill at the Golden Lion in Todmorden while away from home, and soon afterwards was supposed to be dead. When the coffin lid was about to be fastened down, the men discovered signs of animation, and restoratives being applied, he recovered and lived for many, many years after. It is alleged that the circumstance so deeply impressed Madame Beswick that she bequeathed the whole estate to the medical attendant, Dr. Charles White, aforementioned, of Manchester, to be retained by him as long as the body remained unburied.
If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe, and visit us again at Phantom Encounters. I've been Christopher Everett.